I still remember that day as if it had happened just yesterday, even though I was only 5 years old at the time. The day my life changed forever. Dad was away on a business trip, just like always, leaving me and Mom alone in our small suburban house. It was a quiet autumn afternoon, with soft sunlight filtering through the living room window. I was sitting on the floor, carefully brushing the hair of my favorite doll. Everything seemed so peaceful. Until the doorbell rang. Mom was in the kitchen. I saw her freeze the moment the sound echoed through the house, her hands gripping the dish towel tightly. Something was wrong. I watched as she hastily wiped her hands on her apron and rushed to the door. When she opened it, her face lit up in a way I had never seen before. Her voice trembled, but not with fear. There was something else. Something almost like anticipation. "Victoria, sweetheart, go play in your room," she said, her tone slightly urgent. I didn't understand what was happening, but I obeyed. I ran upstairs, but instead of going into my room, I hid behind the stair railing, peeking down into the living room. The man at the door was tall, wearing a long black coat. I had never seen him before. Mom didn't close the door right away. Instead, she stood there, whispering something to him. Then suddenly, she turned away and hurried into the bedroom. I held my breath as I watched her open the closet and start throwing clothes into a suitcase. She moved frantically, almost desperately, as if she was afraid that if she hesitated for even a second, everything would fall apart. I stepped out from my hiding spot, my heart pounding. "Mom, what are you doing?" I whispered. She didn't look at me. She zipped up the suitcase, her eyes avoiding mine. "I have to go away for a while, sweetheart," she said softly. "Go where? When will you be back?" I asked, feeling a rising fear in my chest. "I don't know," she answered, still not looking at me. She brushed past me, grabbed the suitcase and walked quickly to the door. I ran after her, trying to grab her hand. "Mom!" I cried, tears welling in my eyes. But she didn't stop. No hug, no goodbye kiss. The door slammed shut, and all I saw were the red taillights of a car fading into the empty street. I stood there, stunned, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I waited. She had to come back. She must have just gone to buy something and forgot to tell me. But as night fell, the house grew eerily quiet. I was hungry, but I didn't know what to do. I reached up to turn on the light switch, but it was too high. Darkness wrapped around me like an invisible monster. I curled up on the couch, clutching my doll tightly. I didn't know how long I cried. My sobs turned into silent hiccups and eventually, exhaustion took over. I didn't know how long she had been gone. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that she never came back. She would never come back. I don't remember how long I sat curled up on the couch. The house was pitch dark, so silent I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. The door remained shut. Mom didn't return. I cried until my throat burned and my tears dried up. All that remained was the crushing weight of fear in my chest. I kept telling myself this was just a nightmare, but as the streetlights cast faint beams through the window, I knew the horrible truth. Mom had abandoned me. I don't know how many days passed. I didn't dare open the door. I didn't know how to use the stove, so I just clutched my doll and curled up on the couch. I couldn't sleep because the darkness suffocated me. I hated it. I hated the feeling of being swallowed up in a world where no one was there. Then, one day, there was a knock at the door. At first I curled up tighter, too scared to breathe. But then, I heard her voice. "Mrs. Maggie, our neighbor." "Victoria? Sweetheart, are you in there? I've heard you crying for days. Open the door, darling." I don't remember how I managed to get up and unlock the door, but the moment I did, a flood of people rushed in. Mrs. Maggie, the police, and a woman I didn't recognize. I looked around. Mom wasn't there. And then, Dad came home. He knelt in front of me, his pale blue eyes filled with pain. He reached out, touching my shoulder gently, as if afraid I would shatter into pieces. "Vic." "Oh God, my baby." I don't know what made me cry again. Maybe it was his familiar voice. Maybe it was the warmth of his arms around me. I buried my face in his chest, sobbing. From that day on, my life changed. Dad took time off work to stay home with me. I met Dr. Levine, a therapist who always spoke in a calm, reassuring voice. She told me my fear was understandable, that none of this was my fault. But no matter how hard I tried, the darkness haunted me. Every night, I curled up in bed, heart pounding. I always had to sleep with a small light on, and I was always afraid that if I fell asleep, someone would disappear. It was just Dad and me until Elise came into our lives. Dad met Elise at a coffee shop. I remember how wary I was when he first brought her home. But Elise never pushed. She was just there. One day, as I struggled with my homework, she sat beside me and gently asked, "Would you like some help?" I nodded. Then, she started braiding my hair every morning. She never tried to replace my mother. She was simply a quiet, steady presence I hadn't realized I needed. Over time, our little house didn't feel so cold anymore. I turned 10 on a soft spring morning. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming cherry blossoms. Today was special, not just because it was my birthday, but because Dad had promised to come home early for a small celebration. Elise had been in the kitchen since early morning, making pancakes. My favorite. Dad had gone out to pick up my present, leaving just the two of us to decorate the living room. Elise always knew how to make me laugh, and even though I never said it out loud, I loved her more than I realized. Everything was perfect. Until the doorbell rang. I walked to the door, still smiling, until I saw her. "Mom." She stood there, looking older than I remembered, but those brown eyes were the same. Her gaze swept over me, as if she wasn't sure who she was looking at. I froze in place. Beside her stood a small girl with curly brown hair and green eyes, clutching a stuffed bear tightly in her hands. She looked at me with a mix of curiosity and hesitation, as if she could sense the tension in the air. Before I could say anything, Dad appeared behind me. The moment he saw Mom, he stopped in his tracks. "Lauren?" His voice was dry, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Mom bit her lip, her eyes welling with tears as if she was about to cry. "Ethan, I'm sorry for showing up unannounced, but I had no other choice." Dad clenched his fists, but he remained calm. "Why are you here?" Mom took a deep breath, placing a hand on the little girl's shoulder. "This is Emily." She spoke slowly, as if carefully weighing each word. "Your daughter?" I felt my heart stop. Dad's eyes widened, as if someone had just punched him in the chest. He looked at Emily, then back at Mom, speechless. "I was pregnant when I left," Mom continued, her voice shaking. "I didn't know until I was already far away. Ethan, I know I made a mistake. But she deserves to know her father." No one spoke for a long moment. I watched Dad, waiting for him to deny it. Waiting for him to wave it off, to say this was some cruel joke. But instead, I saw him slowly kneel in front of Emily. "Hi there," Dad said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm Ethan." Emily pressed her lips together, her wide eyes searching his face. "Can I call you Daddy?" she asked softly. I felt my chest tighten. Elise had been silent the entire time, but I saw her hands clench. I didn't know what she was thinking, but I knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. Mom and Emily's arrival changed everything. Within a week, Mom moved in as if she had never left. Emily had her own room, decorated with butterfly and floral wallpaper, filled with brand new toys. Mom carefully picked out every item for her, constantly checking if she liked them, if she was comfortable. And me? I was still in my old room. A place filled with memories that no longer felt safe. At first I thought maybe I was overreacting. But as time passed, I started noticing the difference. Mom never touched me the way she did Emily. She didn't stroke my hair, didn't kiss my forehead goodnight, didn't ask about my day. The questions she did ask me were brief, detached, as if I were a distant guest, rather than her own daughter. Dad was different. He still loved me, still cared, but he didn't see the shift happening right under his own roof. He thought it was just a matter of time. "Victoria, you have to give your mom a chance," he would say whenever he saw me withdrawing into myself. But I didn't need a chance, I needed a family. To Mom, Emily was the child who needed to be nurtured, loved, cherished. And me? I was just a remnant of the past she wanted to forget. Dinner conversations revolved around Emily. What she did at school, what foods she liked, where she wanted to go that weekend. If I spoke, Mom would respond briefly before turning back to Emily. Once, I tried to join the conversation. "I got an A on my science test today," I said, hoping someone would care. Emily giggled. "Do you want Mom to put it on the fridge?" she teased. Mom laughed too. Dad was the only one who reacted. "That's great, Vic, I'm really proud of you." He smiled, but all I felt was an ache inside. Dad was proud. But did anyone really care? I slowly realized I was just an outsider in my own family. As the years passed, I spoke less, smiled less. I stopped expecting hugs from Mom. I stopped trying to get her attention. I learned how to disappear while still standing right there. When it came time to choose a college, my decision was easy. I chose zoology, a field dedicated to studying wildlife. Because animals don't abandon anyone. On the day I left, no one cried. Dad hugged me tightly and told me to call often. Mom simply nodded and told me to take care of myself. Emily looked at me with an expression that felt like she had won something I could never take back. And I walked out of that house, knowing I would never truly return. 4 years of college passed faster than I expected. I immersed myself in the world of animals, finding comfort in creatures that knew nothing of betrayal or favoritism. I learned how to care for wildlife, studied conservation, and spent countless hours in nature reserves. There I felt more valued than I ever had at home. But no matter how far I ran, I still had to face reality. I graduated with a degree in zoology, but I didn't land a stable job right away. I had no solid plans, nowhere to go, and I never imagined that even the house I grew up in would no longer welcome me. "So, have you thought about moving out?" Mom asked, casually, on the very night I returned home after my graduation ceremony. I looked up from my plate, slightly confused. "Moving out?" I echoed. Mom sighed, setting her fork down as if speaking to a child who refused to understand. "Victoria, you're an adult now, it's time for you to be independent. Your father and I talked, and we think it's best if you find a place of your own." I turned to Dad, hoping he would object. But he just sat there, silent, his eyes filled with guilt. But not enough to go against Mom. So, it had already been decided. Emily smirked, stirring her drink lazily. "I guess you can rent a tiny apartment with whatever little money you make working with animals," she said mockingly. "Or if that's too expensive, you could always stay in a zoo enclosure." I clenched my fists. Emily had always loved teasing me, but this time, something felt different. I was no longer part of this family. Dad didn't object. Mom had made her decision. And Emily was enjoying every moment of it. I left the dinner table without saying another word. That night I sat in my room, searching for cheap apartments online, but all I felt was a growing sense of despair. I didn't have a stable job yet, had only just started looking for opportunities, and my savings weren't enough to afford a decent place. I stepped out of my room to get a glass of water, but as I passed by the living room, I froze at the doorway. Mom and Emily's voices drifted through the air. They were talking. I hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but the sound of my name stopped me in my tracks. "If Victoria isn't here anymore, everything will be so much easier," Emily whispered. "You have to be patient," Mom replied. "Once she leaves, we'll convince your father to sign over the house, then everything will belong to you." My heart pounded in my chest. They didn't just want me gone, They wanted me erased. I stood there, feeling cold despite the heater running in the house. Did Dad know? Was he part of this? Or was he just another pawn in Mom and Emily's plan? I swallowed hard and stepped back into the shadows, knowing that my real battle had only just begun. I left home just a week later. I didn't tell Mom or Emily that I had overheard their plan. I didn't seek help from Dad either. He had chosen silence all these years, and I no longer had any faith that he would stand by me now. I found a small apartment in the suburbs, just within my budget. It wasn't ideal. The walls were a bit old, the kitchen was tiny. But at least, it was mine. But even though I had escaped that house, I still needed a job. 2 weeks after moving out, I received an email from the city zoo. Dear Victoria, we reviewed your application and are impressed with your hands-on experience at wildlife reserves. We would like to invite you for an interview next Tuesday for the Wildlife Rehabilitation Assistant position. I couldn't believe my eyes. I spent the entire evening staring at the email, reading it over and over, as if it might disappear at any moment. On the day of the interview, I arrived at the zoo an hour early, my palms sweaty. I met Dr. Martinez, the head of the rehabilitation program. She asked me countless questions. About my experience. Why I chose this field. How I would handle an injured wild animal. Finally, she smiled. Welcome to our team, Victoria. I nearly burst into tears right then and there. As incredible as working at the zoo was, I still felt lonely. Years of living in my own family had made it hard for me to open up to anyone. I didn't know how to have casual conversations with coworkers, didn't know how to build close relationships. And then I met Jake. At first, we were just strangers on a wildlife forum. I liked reading his posts. Witty, insightful, and passionate. One day, I left a comment, and from there, we started talking. I don't remember exactly when I started looking forward to his messages, but over time I realized that each day felt a little lighter because of him. One late afternoon, I stopped by a small cafe near the zoo to grab a coffee. As I stood in line, a familiar voice called out behind me. Victoria? I turned around. Standing before me was Elise. The only person who had ever been a source of comfort in my childhood. She hadn't changed much. Still had that warm gaze, that gentle smile I hadn't seen in so many years. Oh my goodness, you've grown so much. She looked emotional. I didn't know what to say. But I knew this encounter would change everything. After reconnecting with Elise, we started keeping in touch more often. I felt a sense of relief, knowing there was someone who genuinely cared about me without any hidden motives. One day, Elise called me with an unexpected request. Victoria, I have to take care of something urgent this weekend. Could you watch Ethan for me? Ethan was Elise's 11-year-old nephew. A boy with a mischievous smile and bright eyes. I had met him a few times and liked him, so I agreed. That evening, Ethan arrived at my apartment, dragging a large backpack filled with books and a tablet. Victoria, can I play on your laptop? He asked. I was in the middle of cooking, so I just nodded. Just don't mess with anything important, okay? Ethan eagerly settled in, quickly getting lost in his own world. I had no idea that within minutes, a tiny mistake would change everything. When I brought the food into the living room, I noticed Ethan looking uneasy. Aunt Victoria, he said, his voice shaking. I think I did something. Kinda bad. A sinking feeling settled in my chest. What did you do? I asked, trying to stay calm. Ethan bit his lip. I accidentally hit send on some of your emails, the ones in your drafts folder. The room seemed to fall into complete silence. I rushed to my laptop, opened my inbox, and realized my worst nightmare had just come true. All the emails I had written but never intended to send. My confessions about the pain I endured in my family. My disappointment in Dad. My fear when I discovered Mom and Emily's scheme. And even the feelings about Jake, that I had tried to bury, had been sent. To Dad. To Jake. I couldn't breathe. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Dad called. I didn't pick up. Jake texted. I didn't dare read it. But I couldn't hide forever. By noon, Jake was knocking on my apartment door. I opened it, my heart pounding. Jake stood there, his eyes filled with emotions I couldn't decipher. "I got your email," he said, his voice steady but warm. I clenched my fists. "I'm sorry, I never meant to send them." Jake cut me off. "Victoria, I really like you." I froze. "I've liked you for a long time, but I wasn't sure if you felt the same way." He took a deep breath. "But after reading what you wrote? I don't want you to be afraid anymore." I felt the walls I had built around myself start to crumble. And for the first time in years, I let someone truly step into my heart. 3 days after my emails were sent, Dad called me again. This time, I answered. His voice sounded exhausted but determined. "Victoria, I need to see you, right now." I hesitated, but in the end, I agreed. I met him at the cafe where he asked to meet. When I walked in, he was already there, looking like he had aged 10 years since the last time I saw him. A thick stack of documents sat in front of him. "I read your email," he began, his voice low. "And I realized how much of a fool I've been all these years." I said nothing. Dad took a deep breath, then pushed the documents toward me. "I hired a private investigator." My heart pounded. I couldn't believe what I found out. I opened the folder. The evidence hit me like a punch to the gut. Mom had been siphoning money from their joint account into her personal account for years. She had a secret lover, a wealthy businessman she had been meeting regularly at hotels. And the biggest shock of all, Emily was not my father's biological daughter. I felt my entire body go numb. "I did a DNA test," Dad said, his voice hoarse. "Emily isn't mine. She's been lying to me from the start." I couldn't breathe. Mom had deceived everyone, made Dad believe he was responsible for a child that wasn't his, used Emily as an excuse to return, and manipulated his trust to take over his assets. I looked up. Dad's eyes were bloodshot. But for the first time in years, I saw determination in them. "I've contacted a lawyer. I'm taking her to court." I stiffened. "Celeste, what are you going to do?" "Divorce her," Dad said without hesitation. "And I'm kicking both of them out of the house." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My father? The man who had once been weak, who had let Mom manipulate him for so long, was finally standing up for himself. And for the first time, I felt like justice was finally being served. The divorce proceedings moved faster than I expected. Dad presented all the evidence in court: Mom's financial deception, her infidelity, and the truth that Emily was not his biological daughter. Mom broke down in the courtroom, but there was no way to deny the facts. When the judge ruled that Dad would retain full ownership of the house and assets, she didn't say another word. Emily, the sister who once mocked me, never even looked at me as they packed up and left. For the first time in years, Dad's house was no longer filled with lies. One morning, while visiting him, I found him holding his phone, hesitating. "Victoria, I've been thinking a lot." He spoke slowly. "I want to reach out to Elise." I blinked. "Elise?" Dad nodded. "I owe her an apology. I let her go for someone who never deserved me." I was silent for a moment, then smiled gently. "You should do it." A few days later, Dad and Elise met. I didn't go with him, but when he came home, I saw a relieved smile on his face. Something I hadn't seen in years. Not long after, I received a text from Elise. "Victoria, I'm so happy that you and your father have found your way back to each other. Let's keep in touch, sweetheart. Maybe family isn't about blood. Maybe it's about the people who truly love and respect you." Jake and I continued talking every day. He was patient, understanding, never pushing me beyond what I was ready for. One day, while we were walking through the park, he suddenly stopped. "Victoria, I have something to ask you." I looked up at him. "I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want to pressure you into anything. But," Jake smiled softly, "would you like to officially go out with me?" My heart pounded. For the longest time, I had been afraid of love. I had been used to being abandoned, to being replaced. But looking into Jake's sincere eyes, I knew he wasn't like the people who had hurt me. I took a deep breath and nodded. I'd like to try. Jake's smile lit up. And I realized that for the first time, I was stepping out of my shell and embracing my future. Dad and I decided to finally do something we had put off for years, a long road trip together. "Where are we going?" I asked as he spread a map across the table. Dad winked. "Remember when you were little you said you wanted to visit Yellowstone?" I laughed. "You remember that?" "I remember everything, Victoria." I looked at Dad, warmth flooding through me. After years of pain and being forgotten, I had finally found my true family. And for the first time in my life, I was no longer afraid of the dark. Victoria's story isn't just about escaping manipulation and injustice. It's about finding herself. It reflects a harsh reality. Not everyone gets the family they deserve. And sometimes, family isn't about blood, but about those who truly love and support you. Through pain, betrayal, and loss, Victoria learned to let go of the past, cherish those who truly mattered, and step out of the shadows to build her own life. It's a reminder that we all have the right to choose our own happiness. How did Victoria's story make you feel? Have you ever experienced something similar, or do you have thoughts on how she handled her family? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more heartfelt and real-life family stories.